Hi everyone, my name is Farah Adeed, and today we are going to talk about Islam and economics. The basic question that what is an Islamic economic system or what is an Islamic economic framework is controversial not only historically but also theoretically. To talk about what does Islam actually propose or what is an Islamic economic system, today I have with me Ali Salman. I describe Ali as a public intellectual who's very prominent in Pakistan. He appears on media, writes for different media outlets, and he is also head of a think tank based in Islamabad. Thank you so much, Ali, for joining me.
Thank you so much, Farah, for this opportunity on conversation.
So, Ali, coming directly to your primer, which you wrote 2 years ago, Islam and Economics, a primer on markets, morality, and justice. My first question is, what is in this? Like, what is your main thesis, your main argument in this booklet?
I started asking myself this question. First of all, was there an economic system prescribed by Islam if we can learn it from its original sources, Quran and Sunnah? And was it really practiced? And is it recorded historically? And if so, then what are the basic features of that system? And then my question was that how modern economists, particularly those writers who call themselves Islamic economists, have understood that system. So I had these two paths of inquiry. One was more historical and looking back into the classical time period of early Islamic era, starting from Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, time period, and then looking at modern interpretations of economics from Islamic economics. And one of my main discovery and a modest contribution from this book is that there is actually a divergence between two understandings. My understanding from the historical reading of economic practices in the earlier era was that Islam supported limited government and free markets, whereas the economists writing in 20th century, 21st century, Islamic economists in particular, tend to take a very different and actually almost opposite view, closer to a statist, collectivist, and even socialist view of economy, while drawing inspiration from Islam or Islamic sources. So I thought that that divergence needs to be explained, and I take this view that Islam is closer to limited market and free markets, limited government and free markets, based on certain historical events, and not just an interpretation of text. Actually, I do not depend for my argument on interpretation of text, and I go back into the institutional forms of rules and regulations which were developed.
Interesting, Ali. As you have said that in your book that Islamic teachings propose that means of production or resources um, are collectively are divinely owned, but and they belong to all humankind. However, the extraction of those resources is not free, so that has certain cost. Don't you think, theoretically speaking, it leads, like, it's an open thing and it leads to different interpretation, like state-led socialism or free market economy? So it is basically something within the theory that makes it controversial for everyone to understand.
It is one of the most challenging topics which I have also come across. I think when we try to understand the idea of property rights, as we call it today, it's very difficult to distinguish the property rights in terms of private domain, public domain, and a third one, sort of a community domain. And I argue that the natural occurring resources which are there, um, are available for humankind, without putting into a private property. But let's say if we have done some investment of innovation. I give the example of something as simple as or critical and critical as water. That water is, as a natural resource, and it's a must for life. But and it should be available free of cost, as and also as also demonstrated in a hadith. But then there is a cost attached to the extraction of water, to transportation, to quality assurance, and to ultimately delivery of water, and that cannot be free. So the human effort, this is what my argument is, needs to have some kind of compensation. Um, uh, uh, but then the natural resources should have a collective ownership. Now, that view, by the way, is not consistent with free market capitalism, also, because in the capitalist literature, of course, we have property rights as one of the very important pillars. They are sacrosanct. So, but I revise my own understanding of property rights coming from a religious understanding that, okay, there are some resources which we cannot privatize. But then, if you have, for instance, built a factory, a house, then it should remain a part of the private property. So that's the sort of the distinction which I draw across various dimensions of property.
Interesting. I completely understand that you have a very nuanced, complex understanding of these very complex and nuanced issues. As you just pointed out, that you do not completely say that Islam is all about subscribe to all the principles of free market economy, right? So, while talking about that, you also talk about the role of an Islamic state. w- what this is in political science, this is a very controversial concept, like Islamic state. How do you understand, as an economist, you define the role of the Islamic state, like it should intervene in matters of theft, cheating, coercion in the markets. But my question is, how do you understand the concept of an Islamic state?
Right. So I talk about historically existing institutions, and in this case, the example is that in terms of price setting, in terms of trade, there are very limited restrictions. Right. So it's more of an open market, free market injunctions that we find in Islamic sources. However, when it comes to consumer exploitation, which of course we realize it can happen. Um, Coercive measures are taken sometimes by traders, by businesses. The acts of cheating do also happen, and the information is also something which is exploited by those who have more access to information. So there are many instances where this act would lead to a social loss, and there we need some regulations. And the whole idea of Islamic economic framework, that while we have freedom to do normal business transaction and there is no intervention of state when it comes to prices, uh, but there are strong regulations and institutions and practices in place to check the exploitation of consumer, and also exploitation of producer, by setting out a certain guidelines. Just giving you one example, that one of the ways in which how the consumer and producer were exploited in the earlier times, in prophet times. There was a practice that if all incoming trade caravans were intercepted by local traders outside the city limits, and that provided them an advantage over the city residents. But then the Prophet, when he migrated to Medina and established an early form of a state, this was quite, I think, in that sense, very initial form, even if it was not fully formed as a state as we know it today. But he already he started issuing instructions, and one of the early instructions was that we will establish a market, a physical market, and all transactions would happen in that physical boundary of a market. And he disallowed that practice. He stopped or prohibited that practice of the intervention, the preemption of the trade caravans coming to the city, saying that let those traders who have done hard work and taken risk by bringing goods from far off places, let them come to the market, and then let them exchange their offers with the city residents, rather than having some people going before they would reach market. So you clearly see the role of regulation here, which I describe as important pillars of state. Even today, I think that the modern interpretation of this kind of regulation, which we see in the world, is competition authorities or anti-monopoly, antitrust authorities. So you see it that, yeah, even the capitalist systems, we have freedom, we have economic freedom, but then we also have very strong antitrust institutions. So that was, I think, how I see the role of the state here.
Interesting. So, for the sake of clarity, my question is that you are not offering a new interpretation of Islam, as you also make it clear in the book. Rather, your focus is on the practices and early Islamic institutions to make a case for the limited government, as per your understanding. What are other instances of institutions and practices that makes you think that Islam
Mhm.
actually promotes a kind of a economic system where state is not intervening too much and limited government and etc.
So one of the very important pillars of Islam, as we also practice today, is zakat. So I treat zakat as a form of a tax, which is a low rate tax, and it is mildly progressive. And this is where the idea of the limited government comes in. And zakat is not just 2.5%. It depends on the source of income. It ranges from 2.5% to 20%, actually. But even if you take the highest form of 20%, which is applicable on natural resources, otherwise the normal rate is 2.5 to 10%, depends on the nature of business, salaries, employment of capital labor. You know, that 10% on average would yield a government which cannot be very large in size. If there is a government, theoretically speaking, which is dependent on today, let's say 10% uh, tax to GDP ratio, or 15% tax to GDP ratio, or even 20% ratio, this government would be considered small, comparatively speaking, and that's what I'm saying. So in US, for instance, today this ratio is about 50%. Um, it wasn't the case 100 years ago. 100 years ago in US, this ratio was hardly 5%, early 20th century. But the World War I and the World War II, and increasing government expenditure, led to this growth of the size of the government vis-a-vis GDP, which of course is taxed. Like when we talk about the government, we talk about that taxation. And so my understanding from this historical practice of zakat is that it promoted the idea of a limited government, which, of course, I'm not saying that this was practiced all along the time in different Muslim, governments, but how it at least originally presented and practiced.
So, if Ali, this is the case, and Islam, early Islamic era makes you convinced that it had a limited government and there were all the institutions in place that ensured kind of free trade and all that. What is historically speaking, that makes some economists think that Islam actually promotes an idea of social welfare state or socialism, as we were talking about Muhammad Iqbal a while ago. So, why there is a predominant view that Islam actually is closer to socialism or centralized economy than any idea of limited government or free market?
Right, and this is very important insight which you're bringing, and I totally agree with you that this is how it is commonly perceived. It may not be necessarily correct, and that's why when you read classical or even later Muslim scholars like Ibn Khaldun, you discover an appreciation of markets, of profits, of business practices. But coming to the 20th century in specifically, when you talk about Allama Muhammad Iqbal, he never presented himself as an economist, although he wrote a book, Ilmul Iqtisad, which was published around 1905. But I have read that book, and the one thing which you will see if you read that book is that he is not presenting anything original at all, and
Right.
he is not even talking about Islamic economics. He has just translated. He has just translated the texts, the classical economic text, for understanding of economics for an average Muslim who is reading Urdu, in his time, and he is using the example of even wine and bread quite commonly in his book. So he was not at least at that point he was not at all looking at this aspect. But about 20, 30 years later, especially with the two scholars, Maulana Maududi and Baqir Sadr, two very influential and contemporaries, started writing about economics in an Islamic language. And that was also the time when they were also resisting or reacting against the colonial government, and anything which was coming or associated with the Western government was perceived to be, in my view, anti-Muslim, anti-Islamic, and this idea that there is nothing particularly Western or Eastern about these sources of knowledge was, in my view, was lost on these scholars. And while they were waging a political battle, they were waging an intellectual battle. They were also involved in politics, in social change. And when you read the text, particularly Maulana Maududi, whose earlier writings and influenced the whole generation of Islamic economics later on, uh, you discover how limited his understanding was about the function of economy. I mean, of course, he was not an economist, but he was a religious scholar, as a theologian. But then when you read his very simplistic definitions of economy, you see the problem. And so for instance, he equates the whole economic system with the institutions of saving, and he thinks that the prosperity which the Western countries have achieved is just an accumulation of savings, and savings is coming from the interest or banking, and that's the whole idea of his idea of economic development, which is it's totally, I think it's very limited. It's flawed. It's incorrect. That's what I write in my book, because it's much more complex. You talk about innovation, you talk about trade, you talk about productivity, you talk about technology, but then he is not concerned about these factors of economy. He's just concerned about savings and interest, and that's why if you read the Islamic economics books, they are just talking about this big issue. In their opinion, big issue was just the riba, or interest, which was never, I think, the top issue for any economic system to begin with. I mean, even I had to, of course, historically, it is known that it was only in the last third sermon when Prophet Muhammad prohibited riba towards the very end. And And so there is a also importance of other things which the economist, going back to your questions, I mean, the Islamic economists have ignored, and the central question which they ignore totally is how the wealth is created. And they just talk about how wealth needs to be distributed, and that's the other sort of their concern, that how we need to just get hold of wealth and then redistribute it. Even today people are talking about, okay, let's collect the money and then redistribute it, and then people will not be poor anymore, because that's the whole idea of that's their idea of distributive justice, which is incorrect. Both from Islamic point of view and also from from economic theory point of view. But I think a mix of poor understanding of economics, colonial times, reaction to the government's influence that thought process.
Right, right. Yeah. So I have a connected question with this. As your book argues that early Islamic institutions and practices promoted the idea of economic freedom and growth and development. How do you explain or understand the existing underdevelopment of the Muslim majority countries compared to Western countries? Do you think uh, Islamic economists are to be blamed for that? There is like broader structural reasons there are, like how do you understand it?
Very important point. First of all, I agree with your observation. That's how most of the Muslim majority countries today are placed. Most of them are poor, in terms of economics, and very few countries are middle income or slightly towards upper middle income, like Malaysia or Turkey, and couple of states in the Gulf, right? So, but all other countries are unfortunately have not done quite well in economics. But that's not just the only problem they have. They also have a lot, a degree of authoritarianism. They have a strong degree of radicalization. It's like these problems are related. The idea that Muslim societies broadly have not embraced the idea of freedom, broadly speaking, economic freedom, political freedom, and religious freedom, I think explains a lot in their underdevelopment. But for instance, if you look at also the Arab states, especially in 1940s, 50s, and 60s, uh, think about Iraq, think about Egypt, and they adopted socialist policies all along the way. They were not concerned about adopting the free markets. They were dictators. They wanted to have a system which they can control, uh, and they imposed those conditions in those societies, which ultimately suppress the potential in their societies to grow and create wealth. So I think a lot of that was politics. A lot of that was also and the degree of their governments, which were non-representative in nature, and they did not allow their people to take control. And that's why I think we are here. And those countries which have done differently in different well are in the Muslim majorities societies are those countries which have adopted more open systems of economy and more open systems of politics also. I think that and thirdly, a relatively high degree of personal freedom. I say relatively because if you start comparing them with, let's say, if personal freedom is available in Europe today, you may not be able to still relate that quite confidently. But I think there are various reasons of underdevelopment of these countries, especially and the lack of economic freedom is certainly one of the major, but there are other factors also.
How do you think colonialism affected these countries? Several of them have been colonized previously, and as a matter of historical continuities, imperialist system, many of scholars and experts argue, tends to marginalize and exploit developing countries, including Muslim majority ones. How do you see the impact of colonization and the current international system?
Right. So I think it's like the in my view, there is a mixed argument here. If you look at, for instance, British legacy in our part of the world, it is correct. Of course, you're right that they also were in extracting resources from here. But I'll give you actually two examples from Asia. And first example I will give you is the example from Japan. Totally different case. Japan was historically a closed society till like mid 19th century, and it was so-called a gunboat diplomacy from US, which forcefully opened the Japanese society, and it opened the Japanese economy to the to other inventions, to other system, and gradually they adopted technology. And then in 50 years from um, 1850 to around 1890s, they caught up quite rapidly with the level of development. It would not have been possible if they were not open. And similarly, I think the colonial governments in at least in India and Pakistan also brought several institutions, including the education system, rule of law, which were helpful in eventual development of these societies. And then, many decades on, I think some of the responsibility, of course, lies in contemporary leadership in generation which we have today. That how much change can is in their power. How much influence can they exert to make a change. Last week, I heard news, for instance, that India is revamping the old criminal justice system, CRPC 1870, so these societies are still under the influence of those systems. But my point is that we also have examples of change, of changing the system, and that's a choice which we still have. So to conclude my answer, that I say these things that history has a mixed argument. Uh, there are positive influences of colonizers, which we tend to, I think, sometimes ignore. And then secondly, in terms of contemporary politics, we still have agency and we can look for changes.
This is very controversial, by the way. How colonization affected and still continues to affect the colonies. Anyways, moving forward, a counter argument to your understanding and your book is that one of the many reasons why Middle East could not develop and become free is because of the Islamic law and Islamic institutions like work, law of inheritance. Uh, these institutions, this is a view by Tamur Quran, who argues that these
Yeah.
institutions basically did not allow to develop large corporations, big businesses. Uh, so large business empires could not grow in Muslim majority countries, particularly the Middle East, compared to the Western Christian majority countries. So, how do you respond to this critique or counter argument?
So my view is that it is right that a lot of the long overdue changes in these structures were not undertaken, and they took longer of time. For instance, in if you look at the Tanzimat in Ottoman Empire, they began to understand the importance of the reforms which were needed in these structures, but it was quite late in the day, I would say. And by that time, these institutions, corporations in the West have have acquired a prominent role. while in our part of the world, we continue to adopt the old institutions. I mean, there was, of course, in a historical evolution which needs to take place. Now, for instance, if you look at the work, uh, 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 the author of the Early Islam and Birth of Capitalism, he takes a different view than other than the Timur Quran, and he says that the institution of Waqf, for instance, the which is the modern institution of the trust, was important not just from property rights perspective, but also for making sure that there is a large degree of social welfare being implemented through families and not through state. Um, but having said that, I think the changes are still needed to make sure that these institutions are not taken, in that sense, sacrosanct in a religious sense. That if we want to improve some of these regulations, then we can still do. So some of the criticism is quite valid, but I think again it depends on how we read history.
Right. Ali, my last question. Is there one Muslim majority country you can present as a model, as a role model for rest of the Muslim majority countries, that this is how, not so ideally, but so to speak, like in a pragmatic sense, how Islam has to be reconciled with free market ideas and competition and limited government? Is there any country?
It's very difficult to pinpoint a country. And people ask me, for instance, when I talk about capitalism, free market capitalism, people ask me, "Oh, can you point out to a country?" And then they suddenly think about U.S. and then they find faults in even current government U.S. For instance, how the government is playing a role in economic recovery and all
Right.
that. I think it's very hard to pinpoint a country in a theoretical sense, but still we can think about Malaysia. I think has done reasonably well in terms of a system where relatively high degree of economic freedom have existed with democratic institutions, with political institutions, and with some limitations on personal and religious freedom, particularly when it comes to Muslims, tend to have less degree of freedom than non-Muslims in Malaysia. So there
Very
are
interesting
those.
observation.
That's right. I mean, if you go to Malaysia, you will see that Muslims have less freedom and non-Muslims have more freedom
What do you
to
mean by this?
to.
I'm curious. I'm just curious to understand. What do you mean by this?
Well, Malaysian government follow a very strict version or interpretation of Islam, and when it comes to the Muslims, they do not want to hear anything other than the Shafi'i version of Islam.
Right,
And for instance, they would not welcome the open religious practice by Shias at all.
right.
And so that they can land into a trouble. So these are the things which I say that okay, Muslims have less freedom in Malaysia than non-Muslims
Maybe
who
the
are
only Muslim
Westernized.
majority country which has this kind of division.
Maybe that. But I think also Turkey had done well, but recently the trend in Turkey has, closely followed more central government,
Yeah.
even authoritarian tendencies. So there are those issues which we see, but by and large, I think we are still far from a time where we can point out to a single Muslim majority country embracing these level of economic development and freedoms.
Ali, thank you so much for this productive and informative conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.